Hi everyone. Hi CenCal Dreamin peeps. How we doing? Let me get my stuff all set up for us today. I'm so excited to be here. Let me see. Make sure y'all can see my screen. Does that look visible for everyone? Looks good. Sweet. All right. So hello everyone and welcome to this year's CenCal Dreamin event. I'm so excited to be here presenting today as this is my first time being a speaker at CenCal Dreamin. I've always been an attendee, so it feels super euphoric being on the other side this year. So thank you for having me and thank you for tuning into my presentation as we're going to be discussing a very important topic to bring further representation and awareness into the Salesforce ecosystem for marginalized groups, specifically Indigenous Native members. I'd love to hear any questions y'all might have, so I'll be sure to answer those at the ending of this. So let's get started. So as I mentioned, today's presentation is going to be on a newly created user group that I started called Indigenous Trailblazers, which is a Salesforce user group made specifically for Indigenous natives in the ecosystem to come together and have a safe space for discussing our cultures, whether that looks like beadwork, ceremonies outside of tech, and other culture activities, but also sharing Salesforce opportunities and building native connections within the Salesforce community so that we can empower each other. For the agenda of this presentation, I'm going to be introducing myself in more detail so that you can learn where I came from and my Salesforce journey. And then I will be giving a content warning as we dive deeper into my social mission called Strayed Roots and how that created inspiration for creating Indigenous Trailblazers. We also will get to learn about how I implemented Indigenous Trailblazers with zero experience or knowledge in creating a user group. So if that's something you've been thinking about doing, I'll go into more detail of how you could start it on your own. And then you'll get to have an inside peek of what Indigenous Trailblazers looks like today. And finally, to finish this presentation, we'll be discussing why representation for all marginalized groups are important, especially having these spaces within the Salesforce ecosystem and community. So as I mentioned, previously, my name is Ray Sage. My pronouns are they, them, and I just turned 24 years old this year. I am Indigenous and Mexican. I have been in the Salesforce ecosystem for roughly around 5 years now. However, I only claim to have 3 years of hands-on experience working with Salesforce projects. The reason I don't count those previous 2 years is because I was 19 years old debating if I was too young to get into tech and if people would even take a 19-year-old seriously. So majority of those 2 years I spent playing with Trailhead and just getting involved in community events to gain volunteer experience. When I did start to get hands-on experience, I worked for 2 small businesses who were Salesforce partners. And when COVID happened, I was unfortunately let go due to budget cuts, but it led me to my current position with Bitwise Industries. And, I couldn't be more happier. When I worked for those 2 companies, though, I basically was like a contractor. And it allowed me to get a lot of experience with contracted projects ranging from 3 months to 12 months. And I was able to build like my project representation that way. I also got to work with different Salesforce products. And the one that I had the most experience with was Salesforce CPQ. I used that knowledge to construct and implement my first ever CPQ course for beginners, and I ended up teaching 40 plus BIPOC students for free, and more than half of those students today are now all certified in Salesforce CPQ. So I'm very proud of them, and if they're here today, I just want to let you know that I'm so proud of you, and I see all the things you're doing in the ecosystem. This also is just a fun fact about myself, but I've been a previous speaker for a few other Salesforce things, such as 100 Days of Trailhead, Campfire Stories Alumni, Salesforce Labs, and Salesforce Career Conversations. They're all great platforms. You can find those previous speaking presentations on YouTube and Spotify if you search it with my name. I also included some of my favorite Salesforce products, which would be Pardot, Nonprofit Success Pack, CPQ, and Billing. I've had so much fun working on projects with those products, so they are definitely my preferred. I also just included some random other STEM experiences that I have that people don't really know much about that I have, But to go over those quickly, I have 2 years experience volunteering with Out in Tech, and I'm a part of their Cutie BIPOC and Disability Leadership Board. I organize and host community events and moderate these communities. I also developed my own website called straighroots.com with no website development experience at all. And you can definitely tell when you look at it that my website was a very beginner thing. It's a work in progress. I have 3 Google certificates in project management and Google Analytics. I have 1 developer certificate that I don't really use, but it's good knowledge in MATLAB. Um, I have 5 years experience majoring in biology, 1 year experience volunteering on agriculture fields, where I would pick and package the products while taking care of the plants and farm animals. Lastly, which people find the most interesting, is I have 3 months experience interning at NASA, where I worked closely with NASA scientists and experts to conduct research on if humanity could survive on Mars and if we were to ever experiment sending human species to colonize that planet. And it was actually really fun working with NASA scientists on this. So that's pretty much all about me as far as my tech experience go. And if you ever want to keep up with me and the crazy things I do in tech, you can follow my Twitter, which is Indigenous Tech, or my LinkedIn, which is RaySage. So before we dive deep into how Indigenous Trailblazers was born, I want to give a trigger warning and content warning. When we discuss anything that is Native topic or about being Native or Indigenous, we cannot leave out the brutal history that comes with this. So you will be hearing discussions about genocide, reservation lifestyles, the United States laws around Indian acts, racial experiences in tech, and discussion about mental health awareness for Native communities. And these historical contexts are needed to understand the overall importance of Indigenous trailblazers and why, for these reasons, it's extremely important in creating safe spaces for marginalized groups. So with that being said, let's discover what inspired the start of Indigenous trailblazers. So before the pandemic started in 2019, I had moved away from my reservation where it was resigned and started a new journey in Orange County, California. It was a huge culture shock for me because I was living in an environment where people had money and showed that they did. And I had never seen so many expensive cars, houses, designer clothes, like at all in my life. And if you've ever been to Orange County, you could tell like that's where kind of like the rich people live. This caused me to have a really hard time finding my social group since I came from nothing and no one else, unless you're Native, really understand what it's like to live on a piece of land the government plants you on away from society. I remember I had just put myself in college and I was trying to make friends in my class, and they had invited me to like a yacht party, which made me really uncomfortable because I wasn't on the same financial level they were. And I remember I had just like felt really overwhelmed. So with not having a social life, I kind of became isolated and just focused on my own personal goals, which resolved around, job careers and academic careers. Um, I started dating someone who I'm no longer with, but they had a family in the Salesforce ecosystem and introduced me to it. At this time, I was still super young and still hesitating on like if I was going to be accepted because of my age, but also because of my culture and where I came from. Reservations don't have a lot of technology and or like what you would call being up to date with today's city environments. So I ignored the offer and continued working below minimum wage jobs just to get by until one day I kind of woke up and experienced something that would change my life. I woke up with immense pain that progressed to the point where I was partially disabled at the age of 20 and had to get an intense spinal surgery, which caused, limit on the jobs I could take on. So around this time after my back surgery, I was introduced to someone who just started their small business for Salesforce Consulting. I was still terrified at working in tech. So they hired me as their office manager, where I would like stock papers, clean the office, restock the fridge, and all those things that come with being an office manager. They asked me if I knew anyone else that they could hire on because they were still building their business. Specifically, they wanted people who were underrepresented, and I immediately suggested my friend and his husband. They were both hired on, and I later learned that my friend's husband was Native as well, and he came from the Blackfoot tribe. But he was too scared to ever talk about it or bring it up because he didn't grow up with that culture. He didn't, he wasn't raised on a reservation. He didn't have strong ties to his people. And he always felt outcasted when he would talk about it because he didn't look Native. He looked more white passing. Which at the time, moving away from my environment felt like I was being outcasted as well, and I could relate to his pain. But it was nice having his presence there during that experience because there is some situations where we face that were questionably, racist microaggressions from someone who also claimed they were underrepresented. So it was just nice to have another, Indigenous person feeling outcasted there to kind of share the pain and vent to each other with. One day, my friend's husband and I were sitting there during work and we were talking about, culture stuff. And I began teaching him little by little about Native cultures and how to make beadwork, what Two-Spirit was, how to make our foods, and would document the history of my tribe and my experiences to give him some kind of connection to Native culture. It then hit me, and I started to think about how there's so many Native people existing that don't have ties to their native tribes or cultures because of blood quantum. For those of you who don't know what blood quantum is, a little history. So, after the United States colonized Native Indigenous land through uh, murder and brutal acts, the United States created an agreement with Native tribal members that they could get pieces of their land back called reservations and get some small benefits only if they followed the blood quantum laws, which is a measurement of how much Native blood is in you. So if you think about this and why this is genociding and actually a terrible method for Native tribes, I want you to think about how do communities keep bloodlines strong historically? And how has that affected their communities? That is essentially what this law is forcing natives to do within their communities. Therefore, tribes are getting smaller and smaller over time. Because if it's not from health issues from this, it's from refusing to follow these laws and having a lot of mixed, native individuals. And eventually that blood quantum grows to zero. So while I was teaching my friend's husband all this information, that was the birth of Strayed Roots, which later influenced Indigenous Trailblazers. Strayed Roots started off with just me going and trying to find half-breed natives or low blood quantum natives and teaching them everything I knew so that they could feel a sense of belonging to a culture that they were pushed out from or didn't get to learn about. I would host small gatherings to teach beadwork, make food, teach about ceremonies, and then that grew into helping natives get into tech and or marketing. And I explored how I could do this for the Salesforce ecosystem. So while I was getting Strayed Roots out there, I had a lot of people within the Salesforce ecosystem wanting to learn more about it and thought it was an awesome mission. I had spoke with two people within the Salesforce ecosystem that are very well known that asked what I wanted to do with this Strayed Roots group. And I had mentioned that I want to expand something similar to Salesforce, but I want to keep both these things separate because not every native or indigenous person wants to be in tech because this can cause further discrimination that they could face in their own communities. And they didn't want to risk that, and I understand that and I respect that. So this, I guess, gave an unintentional open invitation for a lot of Salesforce allies to put a lot of their opinions and suggestions while none of them were native themselves. And they tried to have my voice on their personal mission platforms. And as much as I felt honored in some way, I also felt overwhelmed because it was almost, around the time where everyone who wasn't BIPOC wanted BIPOC voices and faces on their platforms. Just to talk about their own trauma stories and struggles. And this came with an emotional cost. Because a lot of supposed allies were asking for emotional labor primarily to avoid facing backlash from lacking diversity on their own platforms. But all while they were still, taking full credit. BIPOC people were continuing to help build allies' stances with their voices, but with every, event invitation, every come on my podcast or YouTube video, gave the host most credit, and nothing really came for BIPOC folks besides being able to say they were on their allies' platform, which essentially continues to build allies platforms more than the actual BIPOC persons. And I personally was tired of this. I was tired of BIPOC voices not being from BIPOC people's platforms themselves and having to still abide by their allies' platforms just to be heard. So I began writing out conflicts I faced and knew somehow I needed to fix, and came up with a solution for when creating my Salesforce group. I also made sure to document my concerns and things I needed to prepare myself for mentally and emotionally. Since joining Salesforce, I had not met any other Native person or Indigenous person, so I really struggled with knowing if this was even going to be successful or not, or even accepted in the community. But I started it anyway, and thus Indigenous Trailblazers was born. So, because I had never started a Salesforce user group before, I was struggling to even know where to begin. I remember an old quote that my friend told me one day when I was struggling to understand something, and the quote lives with me today, which is, "You don't know what you don't know, and knowing what resources are available will help create solutions and plans." So I use that quote to create a step one, which is finding people around me who have experience making Salesforce user groups and what their ways were going about it. I spoke to the owners of Trailblazers with Anxiety and the Fresno's user group leaders to get advice on where do I even start to get this going. Do I have to report directly to Salesforce or go through loops of approval, or do I need to, get into contact with someone? I found out that you actually can create your own community and groups through trailhead.com. And how this kind of works is like, you have to, like, promoting those groups falls on you and your platforms unless you are recognized by Salesforce as an official group, to my understanding. Then Salesforce would help you promote it and get your group out there. But I wasn't really ready to go through the process of making this group an official Salesforce group in Salesforce's eyes. I don't know how to explain that better, but because I was just still unsure, if I was even going to be successful. So I started it without Salesforce authorizing it and officializing it. After I figured out where to go to create this group, I then started to ask some friends in the ecosystem for advice, like event planning, if I should make this group public or not, and so on. I spoke with someone you here may know, whose name is Rachel Park, about a lot of this, and she gave me some great pointers from her past experiences with groups. So I used that knowledge to create my plan for how I want this group to be. And then I took my advice and my own plan and created my group through trailhead.com. When I created my group, I made sure to set primary goals, which was making sure that Natives and Indigenous people could find a place for them in the Salesforce ecosystem, and letting allies know they are more than welcome to share this with anyone they know who is Indigenous or Native. As Indigenous Trailblazers stand today, we went from having 0 community members to 16 in the course of 6 months, which might not seem like a lot of progress, but from going to not knowing any Indigenous or Native folks in the ecosystem to finding at least 16 is a huge progress, in my opinion. And it continues to grow with people requesting to join ever so often. Because this is not an official, Salesforce user group, there isn't much talk about it besides what you may see on my own personal platforms. So my hope is that with this presentation today is that someone or anyone will share this information to someone they know who is looking for this group in Salesforce, and know that we are here as a safe space for them. I made a huge rule not to gatekeep any Indigenous or Native person based on their status or blood quantum. They're not required to show proof, and they don't need to know everything about their culture or ties to their people in order to join. I did make a template where people can share things about themselves. And one of the questions is, what tribe do you belong to? But I made sure to also include that if you don't know, that is perfectly okay too. I also use the term Indigenous very loosely because there are parts of America that were once Mexico, and those Indigenous people are recognized too in America. So I leave it open for those as well. And some Natives do not like to claim being Native. So in a way to decolonize that term, they claim Indigenous. So Indigenous can be very broad. So with what I hope you all learned today was not only about just Indigenous Trailblazers, but the history of Native and Indigenous folks. and how important it is to represent all marginalized groups. When we bucket all groups in one, we are dismissing each other's unique stories, our different struggles, and different cultures. And sometimes having separate and specific safe spaces helps our own communities identify what our own community needs for healing, having a family like sense of comfort, and having support from our own communities. When we learn about ourselves and helping our own communities, we bleed into learning about how we also can be better allies for others' communities. We all deserve to be here and share wins and successes and to bring further representation and resilience to our communities and make our ancestors proud. So, with that, thank you for being here today to learn, to listen, and to be supportive. And I hope we all take something away from this that continues to heal our journeys. And again, if anyone wants to stay in touch, my social medias are linked. My email is here. My website is here as well. I'm pretty active, so if you talk to me, I'll talk back. Um, but thank you again, and I'd love to answer, anyone's questions at this time, if anyone has any. I see so much love and support in the chat, and thank you so, so much. Sometimes it's hard for me to get on, a stage and talk because I get, emotional and anxiety and stuff like that. So if you hear my voice cracking, it's just because this is hard for me, but I'm very thankful to be here. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and if you ever see me in person at events, I always hand out sage. So if you want some sage from a good old Indigenous person, come see me in person at events, and I'll give you some good healing medicine. Rachel, I'm so sorry, I would butcher your last name. Do you focus mostly on California or West Coast? Do you ever reach out to Oklahoma? So in general with trade routes, wherever I'm at, really, like if I travel a lot, so if I'm in Arizona and I come across someone who is indigenous or native and they don't have connections with their ties, I'll invite them to come hang out with me, sit down somewhere, go out to eat, and we just talk. But I do focus on all of the tribes in the United States. But for Indigenous Trailblazers, it seems like a lot of our Indigenous members have been primarily coming from California and or Mexico a little bit. But I would love, if you know anyone who's in Oklahoma that's Indigenous and in Salesforce, definitely send them my way and we'll get them in there. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I would love to have open arms for any natives in Oklahoma that are in tech and want to join this. I would love to meet them. Does anyone have any questions like about my tech experiences or want to talk about that, or totally open-ended to, it could be anything that's not Indigenous Trailblazers as well? Abby just joined Out in Tech. Beautiful, Abby. If you can, message me with Out in Tech. My at on Slack is at Ray Sage, and I can add you to the neurodivergent disability groups because I'm a part of both of those. Kiana, what motivates you to keep learning? I get really, this might not be the best answer, but I get really bored in life. So I get bored of doing the same thing every day sometimes. So having a broad spectrum of different things for me to learn keeps me entertained and engaged. And I also have, I have diagnosed PTSD, and a lot of my PTSD has survival, instincts. And with that comes overlearning, because I feel like if I overlearn things and I learn everything about everything, it will keep stability for me, if that makes sense. So having that survival instinct of I want to learn everything so um, I don't feel stuck in one area and I can go anywhere in life, like that helps me a lot. Just keep learning and building my knowledge. But thank you. That was a beautiful question. I love that question. That's so awesome. Are you all located in California? Are you located across the US? Where is everyone located at? California. Beautiful. Long Beach. I love Long Beach. I'm really close to Long Beach. I'm actually located in San Diego, California. Fresno. Beautiful. Los Angeles. I love Los Angeles. Los Angeles has some native events, and so does Long Beach. I know they have their like annual powwows that they have up there where they welcome everyone. So they don't do it just for private ceremonies; they do it publicly. And I've heard some great things about the Long Beach powwow. If you guys ever want to go there and see the culture there. Morocco, wow. Beautiful. That's so far. Thank you for being here. And yes, Ellie, next time you're in San Diego, we should definitely spend time together. I'll give you some sage. Beautiful. I have one question that came to me directly. So it says, with the term ranger for an achievement based on the painful history of the rangers rounding up and collecting escaped Indigenous folks who were attempting to defend their own land from settlers, is this something you think Salesforce would be willing to address and acknowledge? I most certainly hope that is something that they would like to address and acknowledge. Um, you know, that's the reason we're here today, is to talk about those certain things and how Salesforce can improve with some of the terminology they're using, because I know that there's more issues with historical Indigenous terms being used. There's also, um, the term master detail, and, like those terms can be changed too. So there's a lot of things that I feel Salesforce is slowly identifying as a problem. But yeah, I do hope that with this talk today, it would bring the attention to some higher ups in Salesforce and they can talk about that more. Do you have any more tips for those starting out in tech to get over that initial fear, like the imposter syndrome? I feel like the imposter syndrome, and I say this very nicely, I feel like it's always going to be there a little bit, because in tech we're constantly learning, we're constantly achieving new things. There's always updates coming out, there's always new ways of going about tech to make it better for the future. And I feel like with ongoing learning, we have imposter syndrome with ongoing learning because we don't know everything. And I think my best answer for that question is being comfortable with, having imposter syndrome and knowing that that is going to improve over time, with the confidence of knowing that with new things coming out, you can learn it and you will get it down eventually. It just comes with practice and time. So, I think imposter syndrome isn't a bad thing. I think it's a good thing that you can grow comfortable with and acknowledge that that's a learning opportunity. Yeah, I would love for Salesforce to have. It'd be nice if Salesforce could have, because they have talks and events where you could speak to admins, developers that work at Salesforce. It'd be nice if we could talk to how Salesforce as a whole can improve for the community as far as their terms that they're using, and how they can be more welcoming in that factor. Especially another thing that they could take on is more disability accommodations, more accessibility in that area. There's a lot of ways Salesforce can improve for the community. But there's also some great things that Salesforce is doing already too. Sweet. Well, if there's no other questions, I think we can wrap it up here. So thank you everyone so much for having me here. And I hope you enjoy the other speakers that you get to experience. And I hope you all have a beautiful day. Thank you.